I was supposed to go to an Ivy League school, preferably Harvard, like my father, major in business or law, marry someone from a good family, meaning equally wealthy and well-connected, and eventually take over the family business alongside Amber. But that's not the life I wanted for myself. I was always more interested in the arts. I loved painting, writing poetry, and exploring the city's museums. My parents viewed these interests as cute hobbies but nothing to build a career on. They pushed me into extracurricular activities they deemed more suitable, tennis lessons, and internships at my father's company during summer breaks. I went along with it all to keep the peace, but I never felt like I truly fit in with the world they wanted for me. When I got accepted into Brown University, my parents were disappointed it wasn't Harvard but decided it was acceptable enough. They hoped that surrounding me with the right kind of people would finally set me on the path they'd always thought for me. Little did they know, it would lead me to the person who would change my life forever. I met Chad, 29M, during my sophomore year of college. We quite literally ran into each other at the campus coffee shop. I was rushing to get to class and wasn't looking where I was going, and he was leaving with a tray full of coffees for his study group. The collision sent hot coffee flying everywhere, ruining both our clothes. Instead of being angry, Chad just laughed and said, "Well, I guess this is one way to break the ice." We ended up skipping our respective classes and spent hours talking. Chad was everything my parents would disapprove of, which made him even more appealing to me. He came from a working-class background in a small town in Ohio. His father was a factory worker, and his mother was a waitress. Chad was attending Brown on a full scholarship and worked part-time jobs to support himself. He was studying to become a teacher, passionate about education and making a difference in kids' lives. From that first meeting, I knew Chad was something special. He was kind, funny, and incredibly hardworking. He had a way of making me feel seen and understood in a way no one ever had before. With Chad, I could be myself, not the polished, perfect daughter my parents wanted me to be, but the real me, with all my quirks and imperfections. We started dating, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly happy. Chad encouraged my art, pushed me to pursue my passions, and supported me in ways my family never had. When I told him about my dream of becoming a graphic designer, he didn't laugh or dismiss it like my parents had. Instead, he helped me research programs and internships. Of course, my parents hated him from the moment they met him. It was during Parents' Weekend in our junior year. I had been putting off introducing them, knowing it wouldn't go well, but I couldn't avoid it any longer. The meeting was a disaster from the start. My parents couldn't see past Chad's background. To them, he was just some poor boy trying to climb the social ladder by dating me. They constantly made snide remarks about his clothes, which weren't designer brands, his slight Midwestern accent, and his career choice. My mother kept asking him if he was sure he wanted to be just a teacher when there were so many other respectable professions out there. My father barely acknowledged Chad's presence, speaking only to me and making it clear he disapproved. It didn't matter to them that Chad treated me better than any of the trust fund boys they tried to set me up with. They were convinced he was only after our money and social status. When I tried to defend Chad, pointing out his scholarship and his work ethic, my father dismissively said, "Oh honey, don't be naive. Boys like that always have an angle." Despite my parents' disapproval, Chad and I continued dating throughout college. We supported each other through late-night study sessions, celebrated our achievements together, and talked about our dreams for the future. With Chad, I felt like I could be myself and pursue my own path, not the one my parents had laid out for me. After graduation, Chad proposed. It wasn't a grand, elaborate affair like my parents would have expected. We were on a weekend camping trip, something my parents would never understand the appeal of, sitting by the campfire under a sky full of stars. Chad turned to me and said, "I know I can't give you the life of luxury you grew up with, but I promise to love you and support you in everything you do. Will you marry me?" I said yes without hesitation. When we returned from our trip and I broke the news to my parents, all hell broke loose. My mother burst into tears, crying about how I was throwing my life away. My father's face turned an alarming shade of red as he ranted about how I was making the biggest mistake of my life. They told me I was being foolish and short-sighted. "Think about your future," my mother pleaded. "How will you maintain the lifestyle you're accustomed to? What about your children? Don't you want to give them the best of everything?" I tried to explain that Chad and I had talked about our future, that we had plans and were prepared for the problems ahead. But they wouldn't listen. To them, marrying Chad was tantamount to choosing a life of poverty and struggle. When I refused to break off the engagement, they gave me an ultimatum: either I end things with Chad, or they would cut me off completely. No more financial support, no trust fund, no inheritance, nothing. "If you're so set on living like a commoner, then you can do it without our money," my father said. I was shocked by their reaction. I knew they wouldn't be thrilled, but I never expected them to go this far. In that moment, I realized that their love and support had always been conditional. As long as I did what they wanted and fit into their narrow view of success, I was their daughter. But the moment I chose my own path, they were willing to cast me aside. I chose Chad. We got married in a small ceremony with just a few close friends present. It was nothing like the lavish society wedding my parents had always thought for me, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. Amber didn't even show up to the wedding. She sided with our parents, telling me I was making a huge mistake. The day after my wedding, I received a cold, formal letter from my parents' lawyer. It informed me that I had been removed from their will and that Amber was now the sole heir to their fortune. It also stated that I was no longer welcome in the family home and that any future attempts to contact my parents would be dealt with legally. It hurt more than I could have imagined. Not because of the money, Chad and I were both working and managing just fine, but because my own family had chosen their outdated beliefs and social status over my happiness. The parents who had raised me, who I thought loved me unconditionally, had thrown me away because I didn't fit into their perfect mold. For 3 years, we had no contact. I tried reaching out a few times in the beginning, sending letters and leaving voicemails on holidays and birthdays. But my attempts at reconciliation went unanswered. Eventually, I stopped trying. During those 3 years, Chad and I built a life together. We both worked hard, me as a graphic designer for a small advertising agency, and Chad as a high school English teacher. We bought a small house in a modest neighborhood, adopted a rescue dog named Max, and were genuinely happy. Sure, we didn't have the luxuries I grew up with. We couldn't afford fancy vacations or designer clothes, and we had to budget carefully to make ends meet. But we had love and respect for each other, which was worth more than any amount of money. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living authentically, pursuing my own dreams instead of someone else's expectations. 3 years after our wedding, I found out I was pregnant. Chad and I were over the moon. We hadn't been actively trying, but we both wanted kids and were excited to start this new chapter in our lives. We decided to wait until after the first trimester to start telling people, just to be safe. About a week after we started sharing the news with our friends, I received a text message from Amber. It was the first time I'd heard from her in 3 years. The message was short and to the point. Mom and Dad heard about the baby. They want to talk. Call them. I was shocked. How did they even find out? I hadn't told anyone in my family, and as far as I knew, we didn't have any mutual friends who would have passed on the information. After discussing it with Chad, I decided to call them. Maybe, I thought, the idea of becoming grandparents had softened their hearts. I called them and my mother answered on the second ring. The conversation was awkward. My mother did most of the talking, while I could hear my father breathing heavily in the background, occasionally grunting in agreement. She congratulated me on the pregnancy and then, without any reason, started talking about how they wanted to make amends and be part of their grandchild's life. There was no apology for how they had treated me, no acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. It was as if the last 3 years of silence had never happened. But then my mother started talking about sending us some gifts for the baby. Before I could say anything, she kept talking about a list of things they wanted to buy, a top-of-the-line stroller, a custom-made crib, designer baby clothes, even a new car suitable for a family. I was stunned. The gifts she was describing would easily cost over $10,000. It felt less like a peace offering and more like they were trying to buy their way back into my life, and my child's life. When I tried to politely decline, saying Chad and I had already started preparing for the baby, my mother got upset. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped. "You can't possibly provide for this child the way we can. We're just trying to help. Don't let your pride get in the way of giving your baby the best start in life." The conversation ended with my mother saying they would send the gifts anyway, and that they expected to be involved in their grandchild's life. She didn't once ask how I was feeling, how my pregnancy was going, or even how Chad was doing. It was all about the gifts and their expectations. After I hung up, Chad was furious when I told him about the conversation. He felt like my parents were trying to undermine us, to show that they could provide things for our child that we couldn't. "They're trying to buy their way into our lives," he said, pacing around our small living room. "And once we accept these gifts, they'll use it as leverage to make demands about how we raise our child." I knew Chad had a point, but a small part of me still hoped that maybe this was just my parents' clumsy way of trying to reconnect. Maybe if we gave them a chance, they would come around and accept Chad and our life together. "Maybe they've changed," I said, though I didn't really believe it. "Maybe becoming grandparents has made them realize what's truly important." Chad looked at me and said, "Do you really believe that? Or are you just hoping it's true because you miss them?" His words hit home. I did miss my family, despite everything. I missed the good times, family dinners, holiday celebrations, inside jokes that only we understood. But I also couldn't forget the bad times, the constant pressure, the disapproval, the way they had cast me aside when I didn't conform to their expectations. Chad says he'll support whatever decision I make, but I can tell he's uncomfortable with the idea of accepting anything from my parents. He's worried that they'll try to exert control over our lives and our child's upbringing. "We've been doing fine on our own," he reminds me. "We don't need their money or their approval." Amber has been blowing up my phone, alternating between guilt-tripping me for holding a grudge and excitedly talking about being an aunt. She doesn't seem to understand why I'm hesitating to accept our parents' offer. "They're trying to make things right," she insists. "Why can't you just let the past go?" But it's not that simple. The past isn't just the past, it's shaped who I am and the life I've chosen. So Reddit, what should I do here? I really need some good advice on what to do. Update 1. It's been about a month since my last post, and a lot has happened. First, I want to thank everyone for their advice and support. After much discussion with Chad, we decided to decline my parents' offer of gifts. It wasn't an easy decision, but we felt it was the right one for our family. I called my mother and explained that while we appreciated the gesture, we weren't comfortable accepting such expensive gifts. I tried to keep the conversation civil and suggested that if they wanted to be part of our child's life, we could start with smaller steps, maybe a dinner together to talk things through. My mother didn't take it well. She accused me of being ungrateful and stubborn, saying I was depriving my child of opportunities out of spite. "You're making a huge mistake," she said. "You're going to regret this when your child grows up without the advantages we can provide." I stood my ground, though. I explained that Chad and I were capable of providing for our child, and that what we wanted from them was a relationship, not material things. The call ended with my mother hanging up on me. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. A few days later, a truck showed up at our house, filled with all the gifts my mother had mentioned: the stroller, the crib, baby clothes, and even a set of keys for a new car parked on our street. There was a note attached: "For our grandchild. We won't let your stubbornness deprive them of the best." Chad and I were stunned. We didn't know what to do with all this stuff. It felt like a violation of our boundaries. We decided to put everything in the garage for the time being while we figured out what to do. Chad wanted to send it all back immediately, but I hesitated. The situation got more complicated when Amber showed up at our door the next day. She was full of excitement about the baby and the gifts, acting as if nothing had ever been wrong between us. "Isn't it wonderful?" she gushed. "Mom and Dad are so excited to be grandparents. They want to do everything they can to help." I tried to explain our position to her, but she didn't seem to understand. "Why are you being so difficult?" she asked. "Most people would be thrilled to receive such generous gifts. You're acting like Mom and Dad are the villains here." The conversation quickly turned into an argument. Amber accused me of being selfish and holding on to past grudges. "They're trying to make amends," she insisted. "Why can't you just accept their love and move on?" I lost my temper then. "Love?" I said. "Is that what you call ignoring me for 3 years and then trying to buy their way back into my life? That's not love, Amber. That's control." Amber left in a huff and puff, telling me I was making a huge mistake. "You're going to push them away for good this time," she warned. "And it'll be your fault when your child grows up without grandparents." To complicate matters further, word has gotten out to our extended family about the situation. I've been receiving calls and messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all urging me to reconcile with my parents. "They're your parents," my Aunt Sharon said during one particularly frustrating call. "Of course they want to spoil their grandchild. Why are you fighting this so hard?" I tried to explain about the years of no contact, about how this felt less like a genuine attempt at reconciliation and more like an attempt to buy their way back into our lives. But it's hard to make people understand who haven't lived through it. Chad stood by my side, supporting my decisions while also offering a different perspective when needed. "We don't need their money," he reminds me. "We're doing fine on our own. Our child will have everything they need: love, support, and 2 parents who adore them." I'm now 16 weeks pregnant, and instead of enjoying this special time, I feel stressed and conflicted. The gifts are still sitting in our garage, a reminder of the decision we have to make. Chad wants to donate everything to a local women's shelter, but I'm hesitating. Once we do that, it feels like we're closing the door on any possibility of reconciliation. Amber keeps sending me pictures of baby clothes and nursery ideas, acting as if nothing is wrong. My parents haven't reached out directly since the gifts arrived, but I know they're waiting for a response. The pressure from family members continues, with new calls and messages every day. As my pregnancy progresses, I know we need to make a decision soon. We can't leave those gifts in the garage forever, and we need to start preparing for the baby's arrival. But every time I think I've made up my mind, I start second-guessing myself. Chad and I have talked about seeing a family counselor to help us navigate this situation. Maybe an outside perspective could help us find a way forward that we haven't thought of yet. For now, we're taking it one day at a time. I'm trying to focus on the positive aspects of my pregnancy and our life together, but the family drama is always there in the background. I just hope that whatever decision we make, it's the right one for our child. Final update: it's been 6 months since my last update, and I wanted to share the outcome of our situation. A lot has changed, and I've come to some difficult but necessary decisions. After weeks of agonizing over what to do, Chad and I decided to see a family counselor. We had several sessions, both together and individually, to work through our feelings about the situation with my parents. The counselor helped us gain clarity on our priorities and values, and how to set healthy boundaries. During this time, the pressure from my family intensified. My parents, apparently frustrated by our lack of response, started showing up at our house unannounced. They'd knock on the door for hours, calling out that they just wanted to talk. It was incredibly stressful, especially as my pregnancy progressed and I was dealing with the physical discomfort that came with it. Amber continued her campaign of guilt tripping, sending daily messages about how I was tearing the family apart. She even went as far as to threaten to cut me out of her life if I didn't reconcile with our parents. Even though we weren't really talking for the past few years. The turning point came when I was about 32 weeks pregnant. My parents showed up at my workplace, causing a scene in the lobby. They were demanding to see me, saying they had a right to be involved in their grandchild's life. My coworkers were uncomfortable, and my boss had to ask them to leave or he'd call the police. That incident made me realize that my parents hadn't changed at all. They were still trying to control my life, disregarding my boundaries and wishes. It wasn't about love or reconciliation, it was about getting their way, no matter the cost. After discussing it with Chad and our counselor, we made the difficult decision to go no contact with my parents and Amber. We sent a formal cease and desist letter through a lawyer, stating that any further attempts to contact us would be considered harassment. We donated all the baby gifts to a local women's shelter, as Chad had suggested months ago. It was hard to let go of them, but it felt like the right thing to do. We didn't want our child's life to start with strings attached. The day after we sent the letter, I blocked my parents and Amber on all platforms. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but also one of the most liberating. The constant stress and anxiety I'd been feeling started to lift almost immediately. Our daughter, Susan, was born 2 months ago. The birth was complicated, and there were moments when I wished I had my mother there. But Chad was amazing throughout the whole process, and we got through it together. These first few weeks of parenthood have been challenging but incredibly rewarding. Susan is perfect, and watching Chad with her makes me fall in love with him all over again. We may not have all the fancy things my parents wanted to give us, but we have love, and that's more than enough. Looking at Susan, I'm more certain than ever that we made the right choice. I want her to grow up in a home filled with love and respect, not constant judgment and attempts at control. I want her to know that her worth isn't tied to money or status, but to who she is as a person. Yes, she won't have the materialistic advantages my parents could have provided. But she'll have parents who love her unconditionally, who support her dreams whatever they may be. She'll grow up knowing that it's okay to set boundaries, to stand up for herself, and to choose her own path in life. This journey has been difficult, but I don't regret our decision. We're moving forward, focusing on our little family and the bright future ahead of us. Thank you to everyone who has supported us through this journey. Your advice and kind words have meant more than you know. Here's to new beginnings and choosing happiness, even when it's the harder path.